All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another edition of the Single Parents Daily podcast with your hosts,
Chady Dunmore.
and Evan DeMarco. Guys, I'm going to do something I don't typically do, and I'm going to read a little bit of a bio because when I read this, I'm like, wow, I'm going to
Yeah.
just botch this if I don't do this. So we are so stoked to have Debbie Reber on the show. And Debbie is a parenting activist, New York Times bestselling author, podcast host, and speaker who, before creating Tilt, spent more than 15 years writing inspiring books for women and teens and speaking about issues like media literacy, self-esteem, and confidence. So when I read that, I actually had this visual of when in Wayne's World, when they see like Alice Cooper and they're like, we're not worthy. We're like, that's kind of how I felt when I read that. I'm
Oh, it's funny.
like, wow.
But it's
Okay.
Reber, right? Not Reber.
Reber, yeah.
Reber.
Did I say rubber?
You did.
I asked and then I
know.
screwed
It's
it up.
okay. I mean, listen, you were reading, you forgot. It's okay. You did a great job reading. And I'm going to say, we're not worthy.
I have a default excuse for everything. It's 2020. That's just it.
It works.
You do have an amazing resume.
So Debbie, tell us a little bit about, I mean, obviously that's incredible, right? And we want to kind of get more into the Tilt side of things and your evolution, but explain kind of the backstory and going from TV to where you're at now and what was the catalyst for all of this?
Yeah, there was no master plan, I will just say. And one of the books I wrote was for teen girls where I explored different careers so that they could really understand how to pursue the career of their dreams. And it was the book I really needed because I jumped around so much throughout my life. But yeah, I would say that the through line through everything that I've done is that I'm someone who always wanted to have an impact, to do something that was going to make someone's life or a community's life better. And so, I used to make documentaries for UNICEF and CARE. And so I was really interested in kids' lives in developing countries. And then I moved to kids television, but it was educational TV. And that felt really good for what I was doing. And then I was always a recovering teenager while I was doing this. And so I was always volunteering with teen groups. And even back in the 90s when I lived here in New York City, I volunteered with homeless teens who were really marginalized youth. And so I've just always had this like pull for supporting teenagers. And so that's what I did for just many years, and volunteering and writing books and speaking. And I'm what I'm really good at is taking information and strategies that support people and communicating them in a way that other people can really just get and apply in their lives. And so, when I made this big pivot to working in the parenting space, I took all of those skills that I have to communicate and to create content and to speak and to write. And I put all of that towards supporting parents. So there is like a through line, but I have had all of these kind of different career markers throughout the last 30 years.
It sounds like your life would make one hell of an interesting movie.
Wow. Okay.
And who's going to play you? That's the first question is who's going to play you in your biography?
I would have to say, because we share a birthday, I would want it to be Julia Roberts, although we're about the same age, so I should probably choose someone younger. Maybe Emma Stone. I don't know.
There you go.
Nice.
Yeah.
Good choice. I love how you were just saying how you're a recovering teenager. And I think that teenagers, it's the make or break it. Like it's the path where they're on the yellow brick road and they have the two paths to go. It's the path where we have the tools, or the path where we just go and do what we want to do, right? And not follow what our parents said or what educators are guiding us to do. And I feel like there's so much more. There's so many more tools for teenagers as well as parents. And it's awesome that you're creating these platforms for teenagers. And it's interesting that you don't have a teenage daughter, but you made a book for a teenage daughter or teenage girls. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Many books for girls. And I was pretty certain when I got pregnant that I was having a girl. Like I was 100% convinced. And so I was really confused. Like I remember when I found out I was, 7 months pregnant and found out I was having a son. And I was like, are you sure? Can you check that again? And I just really, I couldn't wrap my head around what does that even look like? So yeah, I had to kind of really settle into that and then realize also what a great responsibility and opportunity it is to raise a man, right? To raise a young man who respects women and who is empathetic and has all of those qualities. And so, but I did have to wrap my head around that a little bit.
I can tell you, being the oldest of four, two boys and two girls, and then having a daughter, you kind of won in the kid lottery.
Mm,
And
yeah, I
here's the
think
thing,
I
like
know that now.
I love girls. And you know, like I was so excited when I found out I was going to have a daughter, but I also remember like girls when they're great, they're the sweetest things in the world. But when they're bad, it's like get me on a plane into a foreign country. Like you just don't want to be around them. The mood swings are so all over the
Mhm.
place, and boys are just consistent. We're messy, we're smelly, we break stuff, but we're consistent.
I think also because I had written so many books for teenagers, including I did like a 3-book series for Chicken Soup for the Teenage Soul called The Real Deal. Like I was also really secure in the fact that I know what I'm doing. Like when, the baby piece was tricky and the younger, the toddler, but once they hit teenhood, I'm going to be good to go. And if I had had a daughter, yeah, I think I would have been deer in headlights all the time. Yeah.
That is me, guys.
Oh, I thought you were
Like,
raising your hand to speak. Like,
no,
I'm
I'm
like,
like, I have a daughter, guys.
yes, Chadi.
I'm like, I have a question. Yeah, I
Yeah.
have a daughter, and it's really it's a new world for me. But I would say that I'm learning a lot through these podcasts.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
I definitely want to get that book for her that you wrote as far as navigating through being what we're going to be when we grow up, because she feels like she needs to have it figured out right now. And I'm like, you're a freshman in high school. You don't
Yeah.
have, it's not a college where you're creating what you're going to study as a major. She's like, I just need to have it all figured out as far as what I'm going
Mm.
to study, and so she can choose electives properly and so on.
That paradigm has shifted. Nobody knows what they want to be when they grow up.
Yeah.
I hope so. I mean, I think that it's so tricky for kids to feel at ninth grade that they need to know, have it all figured out. That's so much pressure.
Hmm.
I want to talk about this, but let's get into Tilt, because obviously I think that's really the focus of what we wanted to chat about. So explain Tilt and how that kind of came to be.
So, Tilt Parenting is a resource that I created for parents who are raising kids that I call differently wired. So, kids who are in any way neurologically atypical, that might mean they have ADHD, might mean they're gifted, have a learning disability, might mean they're on the autism spectrum or have anxiety. And I created it now about 4.5 years ago because when I discovered that my son was differently wired and we were moving through the world a little differently than I was expecting, it was so hard to access good information. I felt overwhelmed and isolated and kind of stuck, not knowing what I was supposed to do, and also like a failure as a parent. And so I kind of always knew, I was still writing the teen girl books, but I was getting this really deep sense that okay, once I get through the dark ages, once I get on the other side of what is so hard right now, I've got to do something to help parents like me, because it's not okay for parents everywhere. Our kids are everywhere, but we all feel like we're the only ones going through this. And so I created this primarily as a podcast, and it's grown into a global community of thousands of parents around the world who support each other, and really a movement to try to change the conversation and shift this paradigm for the way that these kids are embraced and supported in schools and in our families.
So I read a recent article that said that kids as young as 6 were being given antidepressants. Ritalin is being handed out, like Halloween candy these days. So what has really happened in the kind of the collective consciousness that's driven this need to almost medicate rather than deal with some of the underlying issues? And then how does Tilt really go about kind of reframing that?
Well, I think it's interesting time right now, actually, because of coronavirus has disrupted education so much, and so we're reflecting on school in a different way. But so much of a kid's job, right, it's to play and to learn. That's their job. And the way that most schools are designed, they're it's an outdated system, a traditional model. It's been around for over 100 years. And so we've got these kids who 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 may be coming across as disruptive or having behavioral problems because the environment is not designed for them. They're being stuck in a classroom where they are basically set up to fail. And so the priority becomes behavioral management, classroom management, whether that means getting kids on meds or behavioral plans that don't ever actually look at what is the big why, the reason for the behavior that we're seeing. And so, I mean, that's a big part of the work that I'm doing, is trying to help, educators and parents look beyond the behaviors and to really recognize that when a child is acting out or is being disruptive, they're not doing it to be difficult or to manipulate or make someone's life tougher. They're doing it because they don't have the skills to do anything differently, and they're trying to get their needs met. And so we need to kind of reframe all of that and start looking at, okay, how can we actually support this child to learn these lagging skills?
It's awesome that she said that, because I know this is a really bad analogy, but I'm going to say it. It's like a bad puppy. When they're not getting a certain amount of attention, they're going to do something to just get any type of reaction out of you. And it's no different, because they don't have any tools to like communicate. And kids
So they
are the
poop on the
same
rug.
way. So, yep, or they'll tear something up that, and doesn't make them a bad dog. It just makes you realize, stop leaving the sweet puppy home alone all day. But no, it's so true though. I feel like, that's something that we all have to just take notice as parents. When kids are acting out, they are usually trying to wave a flag of some sort.
Mhm.
Like, hear
That's
me out.
exactly right. There's a book called Beyond Behaviors by Dr. Mona de la Hook, and she says that like 98% of behavior is not, or bad behavior is not purposeful. It's not intentionally designed to be disruptive or bad. It's simply, you know, a lagging skill or a problem that hasn't been solved yet.
So one of the things that we found obviously is single parents tend to have, we don't want to say problem children, but there are some of these incidences of, whether that's ADHD, behavioral disorders, what you would call, wired differently. And I love that. Or differently wired. Did I say that right? God,
Yeah, I
I
call it
don't know
differently
if I've had
wired, but it works. Either way
yeah,
works. They're
either
wired
way,
differently, differently wired.
I'm blaming the vodka now. Um, but it's obviously the trauma of divorce can cause a lot of these issues. So how is it that you kind of focus on the issue of clearly that we aren't giving the kids the tools, but then what do you do after that? Like, what are some of the things that we really focus on, or you focus on, to help support parents and kids going through the understanding of being wired differently, and how do they maximize the opportunities?
The majority of my work is helping parents do their own deep work, because the way that we show up to our relationship with our child change, it impacts everything. And we know we can't control our kids, like many of us like to think that we can, but we can't. The only thing we can control is what we're making their behavior mean, what we're making our worries about their future mean, how our own fears are impacting the decisions we make and the parenting style that we have. So I really challenge and encourage parents to start to get to know what their own personal triggers are. Like, what are the behaviors that really like drive me crazy, where I make bad choices, or how am I, my own maybe unresolved issues from my childhood and upbringing, getting messed up, and the way that I'm interpreting what's happening with my child. Whether we're with a parent or we're co-parenting separately, that is very complicated, and really understanding, kind of getting on the same page there, in terms of what the intention is, but understanding, like, again, where we're getting triggered with our own stuff. And so a lot of this is doing our own work, committing to leaning into our own discomfort and our own fears, and trying to work on those, so that, I talk about it as like clean energy, so we can show up to our parenting relationship with kind of a clean space, and we're not bringing all our baggage into the equation.
Like holding space for another person. This can relate to anything in any relationship, not just being a
Yeah.
parent. I feel like we essentially have to do our own works in order to progress in our lives.
Hmm. Yeah, every
Ain't that the
day.
truth?
God,
Hmm.
that sounds somewhat like that sounds painful.
I know, but it's the real deal. It's the stuff that we
It's
have
not
to.
easy.
And
No.
I
It
feel
is
like
not easy.
everything gets even more exposed when we become parents, right? Because
Hmm.
it's stuff that we are totally unaware of. Oh, we just shove in the back end or underneath the carpet and we're like, it's all good. Like, I dealt with that as a kid, but it's not a big deal. I'm going to do things differently. And again, what we think that we think we're going to do, it doesn't happen because something triggers us,
Hmm. Yeah.
whether if it's from our childhood or with an ex, because our child does something like our ex, hence the DNA. And
Hmm.
we're like,
Hmm.
that drives me nuts.
You can't divorce your kids.
No, of course not.
Yeah, I mean, I always say that the good news about this is we get a lot of opportunity to practice all of these things because, every day something's going to happen. So I'm really all about intention setting, right? I like to start every day with a clean slate. And I set an intention, my intention today is to hold that space, to
Mhm.
be empathetic to the emotional upheaval, that the anxiety. There's a lot of anxiety in my house right now. And so I try to manage my own energy so that I can hold the space and not feed into that. I
Mhm.
set that intention every day. Some days I do better than others. And, at the end of the day, I repair when I screw up. I try to reconnect and I give myself a whole do over the next day. And I'm going to get more chances every day to keep working on those skills.
Does that make it kind of like Groundhog Day? Like to a certain extent, you still have that ability to redo. You can take the learnings from the previous day and apply those to the next one.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that a lot of parents are also, they think if they've screwed up, it's a bad thing, or, they beat themselves up for a bad parenting moment. And I'll just say that some of the best, conversations I've had with my child have been on the other side of my worst parenting moments because I allowed myself to be vulnerable, to talk through it, and to repair in a way that actually built our connection.
I'm
Yes.
glad you said that because I know that. Well, go ahead. I know
No,
where you're going to go with
I
this.
love that because I heard set intentions and then repair. What does that mean? Elaborate more when you say repair. That's the second time I've heard you say that. And I like that.
Yeah. I mean, it means being willing to admit that you're wrong, which is something that, I don't think I ever heard my parents apologize to me when I was growing up. That wasn't part of how we operated. Um, so it means showing up, owning things that we have screwed up. I really wish I had handled that differently.
Mhm.
Um, I really struggle when I've had this kind of a day to respond in a respectful way, and that was bad on my part, and I'm really sorry. And so it's apologizing, it's being vulnerable, it's modeling our own faults and the things that we're working on. That can, when I've had conversations like that, sometimes there's something I write about in the book where I was like, I was demanding that my son do his coping routine because he was having a big meltdown. And I was yelling at him, do your coping routine, right?
Mhm.
Stormed away. I stormed away. I came back in to check on him like 15 minutes later. He was like happily on his iPad doing something. And I apologized. And like, that was apparently I'm the one who needs the coping routine. I'm so sorry. And he was like, that's okay. He's like, do you want to do my coping routine now together? And he like put on like a CD and we laid down on the floor together and did belly breaths. He was like 9.
Oh,
But we
wow.
had this moment that, I still think about it and it was still meaningful. And it's because I was willing to go in and own up to what I had done wrong. And he was able to grow from that and to be in charge. And it was just a really lovely experience.
At 9, that's incredible.
Our kids are so smart.
I know. They're awesome.
And for them to see that we're projecting our energy on them and them being aware of that. Like,
Mhm.
it's not about me, it's about you.
Mhm.
Serenity now.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
What were you going to say? And I interrupted.
God, no, I've got a ton of questions about this, but I really want to focus on some of the tools, right? Um, what else are you really doing? I mean, we've got all these things in the book, but I'd love for our listeners to kind of get some really nuts and bolts, tools as far as not just working with differently wired or wired differently, or however we're going to say it, but all kids. And I think that in looking at your stuff, a lot of your advice really applies to anybody in this parenting situation, as far as how do we really connect with our kids in a time now where a lot of people are distance learning and there's a lot of tension in the homes. Give us the playbook. What are your best practices for alleviating stress and connecting with our kids?
So the two things that I'm focusing the most on right now, three, but two of them are related. Self-care slash self-compassion is really big for ourselves as parents. And I feel like self-care is so cliche and we don't need to go all into it, but I just am such a huge proponent of relentlessly doing what we need to do to take care of ourselves, because we are all just tapped out right now. We are burned out. Um, there's pervasive anxiety among all of us. And if we can't manage our own energy, we are going to contribute to all the chaos and to what our kids are feeling. And they're feeling it, even if they're not exhibiting it in a way that might look anxious and might look like sadness or anger, or might not even look like something that we're noticing, but they are really tuned into our energy right now. So, just really being, it's non-negotiable that I have to get out and do something every day. I would go for a walk, listen to a podcast, whatever it is. It can be the littlest thing, but prioritizing myself in some way every day, that's a big one. And the thing that I'm trying to remind everybody right now is the need to empathize with our kids' experience. No matter how many times, even if it's the same record we're hearing day after day, I miss my friends, this is terrible, I can't go to school, my life sucks, whatever that, yes. And every single day, we can be like, oh God, this again. We might feel that way, but it's so important that we hold that space and we say, this is so hard. I'm so sorry. Like, I know how hard this is. And you're doing such a good job of getting through this. And I'm here for you if you need anything. And let's, just try to take care of each other. And just that message has to happen every single day, because there is no playbook for this. Our kids don't have the life experience that we have, to know that we will get through this and we can go through hard things and emerge on the other end and be more resilient for it. Like, most of them don't have that experience. And so
I don't
we
think a
just
lot of
want to,
adults have that experience.
Oh my gosh, you're so right. And that's why I'm saying all these advice that she's giving us can play into adulthood in general. Because sometimes talking to a child is like talking to a grown adult. And sometimes children are more, they're more, what's the word? They act more responsible than a lot of adults, and they're more mature.
Well, they're more resilient. I
Yeah.
think, and that's what we're seeing. One of the things that I just love that you said is giving that space. But oh my God, I think, telling your partner that, your boyfriend, your girlfriend, your husband, there's so much anxiety right now. And, you throw the election 2020, hurricane, God knows which one we're on at this point. It's like, when is it going to end?
Mm-hmm.
and telling that to ourselves. So not just, a friend or a partner or an ex, but, I recently talked with Dr. Kristen Neff. I don't know if you're familiar with her work, but she, self-compassion and she was just so good at reminding me of, just turning inward and saying, this is really hard. And in fact, this is the post that I have on my desk right now. I don't know if you can see it.
What do I need?
What do I need right now? So I needed to stick this here because when I'm having a moment, I need to just stop for a moment, check in and be like, all right, what do I need right now? Do I need to call my sister? Do I need to, watch something mindless on YouTube? Like, we just need to remind ourselves that this is really hard and be gentle and lower the bar and, do things that can soothe us in the moment.
And one of the challenges that I think we've heard from a lot of parents on this show, or even just kind of through social media, is that idea of self-love is great, but most people don't even know where to begin because it's like they don't know how to remove themselves emotionally from the construct of the world that we live in right now. It's they go
Mhm.
out for a walk and they're like, am I going to catch COVID from the neighbor if I'm walking down the, and so there's this really interesting paradigm where there's so much fear in the world, and self-care becomes an extension of, well, how do I even begin to take care of myself? Like,
Mhm.
you could at one point go for a walk around the park and then that was that emotional break that you need. Now there's like, you step out the front door, like, am I properly masked? Do I have enough hand sanitizer? What's going to happen? Is a meteor going to hit? Is the zombie apocalypse going to begin?
Yeah. I mean, and living in a city, I'm nature is kind of my thing, and it's harder to access right now. And um, one of the things that my therapist, who's helping me with all of these things right now, is just reminding me, like, take your coffee, go sit on the front porch for 5 minutes, and don't read anything. Don't listen to a podcast. Don't do anything. Just sit there, listen to the birds, like notice what you see. Those little moments, 5 minutes can be really restorative, but we have to prioritize that. If we don't, it's not going to happen.
It's awesome. That's definitely like feeding our soul. What we need is so important. I think I'm gonna write a stick-it note now on my car. What do I need? I'm
Just make
like,
sure it doesn't create a blind spot.
no, of course not. Just do it on the weather.
Can you have like Siri, like just have Siri ask that question every 5 minutes, like, what do you need right now?
Yeah, or put it, like, make a screensaver too. Like, there's all kinds of ways to remind yourself to take a pause and ask yourself.
Hmm.
We'll send out a joint email to our collective lists, with just that. No other call to
Yeah.
action. What do you need right now?
Well, it'd be a great caption too to this in for this podcast. What do you need, and to hear other parents going through whatever they're going through right now, outside of what's going on in the world or what everybody
Mhm.
needs. I know a lot of it, we were all saying that the nature was like a big thing for us, and we couldn't even leave the house because it was the fires, and I felt so claustrophobic. I was
Yeah.
like, this is horrible.
It's
This is
yeah.
a hard time. I mean, this is just hard. I feel I have a lot of friends in California who, during the fires, this is just difficult. And we have to take it day by day, sometimes hour by hour, sometimes minute by minute.
It was funny. The fires have been pretty bad here in Northern California, and it's led to, not really being able to go outside. It's difficulties breathing, 400 air quality. So I went to Mexico last week to film a documentary, and I was doing some stem cells there. And I'm like, I'm going to get to sit outside and breathe for the first time. And then Hurricane Zeta comes through. I'm like, no. Like, so the joke was, and I love this. I walked into the bar and I said, I'd like a Corona and a hurricane. And the bartender said, that'll be 2020.
His dad
It's a
jokes
good
are the
one.
best.
Oh, 2020. It's
Yeah.
going to end.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I don't think 2021 is going to be any better. But hey, let's self-care our way into positivity here. So
Mhm.
I'm sorry.
I want to talk a little bit more about special needs. And again, I think we come back to a lot of whether interesting statistic I also know is that parents of special needs kids, and I don't want to use special needs, but in the context of this, are like 5 times more likely to get divorced. And so whether there's the chicken and egg thing, but let's talk a little bit about your work with Tilt, and how does that really focus on special needs outside of just kids and everything that they need.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, it is really challenging, and within my community, that's something that comes up a lot for a couple of reasons. Just the parenting, co-parenting dynamic. A lot of parents are differently wired too, right? And sometimes they're discovering their own neurodiversity through going through their child's diagnostic process,
Great
which
word.
is
Hmm.
neurodiversity.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I just got tingles.
So it's really interesting. So you've got these differently wired parents, or realizing, like, oh, I just discovered my child has ADHD, and now I realize that I do too. And so um, it's very complicated. And then, within, when you have a differently wired child, there are more demands often, especially when the kids are younger. If they're going to occupational therapy, or there are often more meetings at school and, IEP meetings and, insurance. There's a lot of stuff to navigate when you're trying to get formal support and accommodations. And often it's one parent who's kind of shouldering most of the emotional labor related to all of that. And that can create a lot of challenges because, there can just be a lack of communication, or the one parent who does all the research and reads all the books and leaves them lying around everywhere, earmarked, read this, do this. And then the other parent who, is like, I was like that when I was, her age, and I turned out okay, So the biggest struggle, I think, is getting people on the same page, and knowing that we all bring different strengths to our parenting relationship. So it's not going to look the same. So how can we have compassion for the other person's experience in this relationship and this parenting dynamic? And how can we both show up for this child from a place of our own strength and respect how the other is navigating it? So it's tricky.
Was that a challenge for you and your husband to kind of to figure that out?
Yeah, for sure. Yes. And I was the parent, during the years of dealing with the schools and the early pickups. And, I would come home from dropping my son off and I'd get a call 5 minutes later, like, hey, can you come pick up your son? It's not going to be a good day. And that all fell on me, which impacted, my work, but I was working from home. So I was available to do that. But that was hard for me because I felt resentful that it was all falling on my shoulders. And I felt like I was very much alone in it. And, that kind of over the years ebbed and flowed. But ultimately, my husband and I worked with a therapist who specializes in working with couples who have, differently wired kids or special needs kids, just to help us figure out how can we get on the same page here, so that I wasn't lording over my control, right? Like, and having this self-righteous attitude about, well, I do all of this, and instead kind of get us both on the same page so we could just work better together. It took us a couple of years to figure that out.
I'm sorry. I feel like there's a lot more education on kids who have, whether if it's ADHD, any brain injuries, or any type of cognitive disability. But my brother fractured his skull when he was 4 years old, and was labeled as he had a disability, and he was a typical boy, always getting into trouble. And I was, mind you, we're twins, so
Okay.
I was probably the good twin per se. I'd never get in trouble in school. And he was always like getting kicked out of school from fighting or disrupting the class and so on. And doctors would always want to put him on Ritalin. And he was like a normal boy though. Just because of that head injury, they wanted to give him medicine. Mind you, growing up with two Latin parents, and my mom was the mom who did all the research, went to all the meetings from the county to board meetings to educate teachers on kids like this who have any disabilities. And my dad was a typical Latin man. He grew up in New York, Puerto Rican, was just like, he just needs to get disciplined. And it was hard seeing my parents like fight, because my brother was just, he was my brother. He was just obviously always picking on me because I was his sister, but also too, looking back now, I didn't see much of a difference, like other than my mom just saying we could never, how you call your siblings stupid, or yeah, we would say that. And I couldn't cuss, and I would be like, don't say that. But if I said stupid, anything has to do with calling his like anything has related to a disability, I would get in so much trouble. And it's different now because we're educated more as parents on knowing the difference on what to say and name calling, et cetera, et cetera. And I just, I've noticed that, and from growing up, I wanted to be a neurologist because I would go to all his meetings. I would go to all his doctor's appointments. And he's great now. I mean, he's a normal guy. Was never on medication, but just seeing that the tools that we have now as parents versus what we had as back then. And then also too, the way we're raised I say plays a huge role in us being parents and how we show up as parents, like you were saying earlier. So I think that educating ourselves is huge, and also realizing what do we need, right? Every day, because when we're not falling into the trap of like fulfilling us, that's where we get lost as, venting out to our kids and what is the word? Projecting
Mm-hmm.
our anger
Mm-hmm.
issues or whatnot, because they're not acting like how we want them to act.
Exactly. Yeah.
So curious, what are the support differences between living in Amsterdam versus the US?
Uh, that's a good question. I will say that I never fully immersed into the kind of support tools that were available. I ended up homeschooling while we were living there because often with kids like my child, he probably would have been sent to a school for bad, for disruptive kids. So where all the kids with behavioral problems go. And my child is, in addition to having ADHD, he's profoundly gifted. He's can run circles around me intellectually, and so, but he would have been sent to a school that's really just for like the kids who don't have who are not in that same space. So I chose to homeschool him, and
When do
they're
you sleep?
behind. What's that?
When do you sleep?
I don't sleep a lot. I don't homeschool him anymore, to be clear. But yeah, I'm really good at multitasking, and I also just work all the time. Like I just always have to be. I'm just one of those people. I always have to be doing something. So it worked out pretty well, mostly.
So in kind of building this movement and building this community, what are some of the biggest challenges that you've faced?
I think moving, systemic change is hard because there's so many pieces to it, right? There, education alone, I can get the troops rallied and talk about the need for educational reform and change, but we're still up against this system. There's not much money. There's very little awareness. There's so much education that has to happen first. And so sometimes it just feels overwhelming, while I'm still raising a kid that I'm advocating for and going through the IEP process with the New York City Department of Education. I'm still kind of mired in all of that myself. So I think, just even since I've started Tilt, and maybe it's who I hang out with, but I have seen expanded awareness. Like I feel like it's happening. People are starting to get on board and really understand, that there are so many strengths and gifts that come with neurodiversity, and that we have a responsibility to ensure that these kids can realize those strengths so they can contribute to the world, because they have so much to contribute. They're unconventional thinkers, they're the problem solvers, they're the disruptors that we need in society. But it's really that education piece, and it's hard because if you were brought up a certain way, to get you to shift and look at behavior as not a sign of a poorly parented child, but rather a child who has some unique needs that aren't being met, that's a pretty big switch that has to happen. And then education reform, it feels insurmountable sometimes. But I do feel like COVID is kind of showing the weaknesses in the system, and I think there's a lot of opportunity right now for us to rethink how we educate kids, and within that, all kids, because I don't think the educational model works for most kids, no matter how they're wired. So I'm excited about the potential for some real change because of what we're living through right now.
So we're distance learning here. Are you guys doing that where you're at?
Yeah, 100%. Mm-hmm.
So this clearly is a model that does not work. Putting my
Mm-hmm.
daughter's in first grade, you've got a high schooler, like putting these kids in front of a Zoom call for 8 hours a day is just nonsensical. So if you could
Mm-hmm.
kind of wave your magic wand, what would the new education system look like? Not just for differently wired kids, but in general, how do you fix the whole problem? And maybe
I
that's
think
like
you
a
get
whole
rid of,
podcast.
yeah, I mean, I think you get rid of grades to start with. I think that you really focus on child-directed learning. So you create schools where the teachers are, maybe their advisors, maybe they're coaches, maybe they're there to support the kids' efforts. There are some schools like this. There's actually a school in Seattle, the Puget Sound Community School, which Dan Pink writes about in his book Drive, about what really motivates people. The kind of learning that helps kids become self-directed and explore their interests. We know that that's the way to tap into their genius and their spark. And so if we can kind of forget about these check marks, these arbitrary check marks of you have to do this, this, and this in order to be successful and move on, and instead focus on what are the skills. We want these kids to be critical thinkers. We want them to know how to approach a problem. We want them to know how to move past a failure and learn from it. Those are the things that make people successful in life. And so, more project-based learning that is designed around kids' unique learning styles. And so there's a lot of freedom, and that we're not like testing and caring about grades. So kids are cramming to learn things that have no relevance to their lives or their future.
I remember when I was in elementary school, I was in the GT program, and I remember like early on, I think it was first or second grade, and I asked the teacher, I'm like, what grade do I get? And he laughed. It's like, we don't grade this. It's like, and we would show up and like play with blocks and build things and think about things in critical ways. And it's like, we've forgotten how to do that. Like, I don't even know, does gifted and talented programs still exist anymore?
They do, city by city. When we were in Seattle, we were there. My son did a year of public education in a full-time gifted program. But in Seattle, and likewise what's happening in New York City, there's a big push to eliminate those, because they're also finding that they're not diverse. They're really pulling a largely white audience, and so, or white kids to the school. And so there are all these kids, marginalized kids, who are not being served or identified as gifted. And so they're like, well, let's get rid of all of it now. So
is that an economic problem, or is that, what's the driving force in that kind of lack of diversity?
It's the resources are going to those schools, and those schools tend to be in predominantly white communities. And it's so layered, the challenges, but a lot of it tends to be white parents who put their kids forward for testing for gifted education. And so there's access, there's opportunity, there's awareness, and then there's where the money is going. But I would say too that most gifted and talented programs, at least in the public school system, tend to be really just about acceleration, right? Like, okay, you're really smart. We'll work 2 grade levels ahead. But the kind of learning you're talking about, that's what gifted learning should be. It should be, let's kind of get creative. Let's, look at problems and let's dive into things in a different way, because giftedness doesn't just mean that you can do things at a higher level. It means that the way you even approach anything is unique. You're looking at things in different dimensions and through a completely different lens. And that's what we want to capture.
Well, and I remember the gifted talented program, they really focused on failure. It was as a good thing. It was like, we're going to fail as much as we can, because that's how we learn, versus let's sit down and do our reading, writing, arithmetic, and what was it, the 3 R's, of which only one actually begins with an R. I mean, that's
right.
That should tell you a lot about our education system.
It's true. It's true.
So what's next for you, Debbie? You've got this crusade, you've got a 16-year-old. I'm assuming, what's college look like now? I mean, at a certain point, like, how does that work with COVID?
Yeah, I don't know. I actually just interviewed someone for my podcast about college, the college admissions process, and it is interesting. It's going to change, right? My son's a sophomore, so we have a little bit of time, and I'm like just hoping that, on a personal level, that by the time we get to looking at colleges, that will be some kind of normalcy. I don't know, but yeah, I mean, in general, I think it's a time also to think about, is college. I mean, my son wants to be an aerospace engineer, so he's got his sights set on where he wants to go, and I will fully support him pursuing that. But in general too, I think this is a time to question, like, what does success look like? Um, you know, does it make sense to go right into college? Are gap years a better thing to be doing right now in particular? Because I feel like our kids they're losing some valuable time to just kind of, you know, discover who they are, because a lot of them are in a more heightened anxiety state. And when you're in that state, you can't really like grow and develop the way that as a high school student, you're expected to, or what would normally be happening. And so I'm hoping that people kind of push off college for a year, if they're close to that, take a gap year, take some time to kind of rebuild and do things that really feed you, so you can better discover what might be the right fit for you.
Well, I was thinking about David Sinclair's book, Lifespan, where he talks about, we're obviously living longer, right? So that old model of go to high school, go to college, get out,
Mhm.
become an insurance actuary, and work in a cubicle until you die, like that doesn't make sense anymore. And so, how
Sounds
do we, with
awful.
this extended life expectancy, with all of these opportunities, relook at the model where college might not make sense anymore? Where you
Mhm.
kind of go through maybe vocational training. Obviously, as an aerospace engineer, college is essential, but as a doctor, we don't need any more lawyers, so let's just get rid of all law schools. But then, look at vocational training that allows you, like, for 10 years, I'm going to do this job, and then I'm going to do something else. And in between, I'm going to take
Mhm.
these like semi mini retirements. And I'm actually like, as much as I'm upset with COVID, I think this is a real opportunity for us to kind of take a big step back and say, does this model work anymore? And I think the
Mhm.
ubiquitous answer is absolutely not. Like, it is a
Mhm.
flawed system from kindergarten all the way up to the day they put you on the ground
Mhm.
or burn you if that's your choice.
Yeah, I 100% agree with you. And I think this is a hard thing for parents, because we have to really question all the ideas we have about what success looks like. And for so many parents, it just, there's only one thing, right? High school, college, good job, independent, we've
Pay
got
off the
this
student loans.
idea. Yeah, I mean, and I don't live that way, and I feel like I've lived a very unconventional life. My career certainly has been all over the place. I've loved everything that I've gotten to do. I have a little bit of a Forrest Gump, which we won't go into, but I've interacted with and met incredible people in my lifetime because of the bizarre turns my life has taken, and I don't believe there's one way that this needs to look. And so I'm all for encouraging our kids to find their spark, to find their joy, and to follow passions that could be really unconventional. I really don't have any expectation other than wanting my son, and my wish for all kids is that they grow up knowing who they are, understanding their strengths, and knowing how to advocate in areas where they know themselves well enough that they know, I need help or support in this area, so they know how to get what they want.
Mhm.
Well, and I think that that's the model for education right now, right? Because all of the information is available at our fingertips.
Mhm.
And I think technology has given us a place where we've we've forgotten that we've evolved to the point where the information is available, and then we've stopped focusing on the things that you're talking about, which is teaching kids to know themselves, teaching kids the emotional skills necessary to survive or thrive in this world. And
And to ask for help,
Yeah,
which is
which
something that
is
as parents need to do as well.
100%, and so many of us are terrible at it.
Hmm. That's something
Yeah.
we're learning. That seems to be the common motto for a lot of parents going through any obstacles with kids, is to know that there is a community of us and that it's okay to ask for
Mhm.
help, whether if it's with therapy or resources with podcasts
well,
like
and look,
yours.
we deal with a predominantly single parent, and there's a lot of shame that goes into becoming a single parent. There's a lot of guilt, and so with that, a lot of the parents that we speak with find it very challenging to ask for help, and that's one of the things we want to encourage is there are resources not only for your kid, whether that's Tilt, and we'll obviously put a lot of that information in the show notes, but as a single parent, there are people out there willing to help, and there's a lot of resources available. So obviously we love Debbie for being one of those resources.
Thank you. Thanks.
I think we're about out of time. I think we'd scheduled a 45 minutes. So we got
Yeah.
anything else you want to chat about?
No, I just want to say thank you so much for just highlighting on not only the children what they need, but also parents and what we need, because I feel like when we show up better for ourselves, we show up as better for our kids.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. I really, I love that this conversation went all over the place. It's my favorite kind of conversation to have.
Yeah, and we don't need ADD or Ritalin because of it. Like,
Right.
yeah, like,
Exactly.
Debbie, where can people find you?
Tiltparenting.com is kind of the home, and people can check out my podcast. You can read a chapter of my book, join the parenting community if you're looking for resources, or even contact me directly. And that's my handle at Twitter and Instagram and Facebook as well.
And we'll put all that information in the show notes. And I encourage people to not just read the chapter, but read the whole thing. Read the whole book, because,
Yeah.
it makes more sense that way.
Well, once you read the first chapter, you're going to be hooked.
You're
so,
hooked. There
yeah.
we go.
There you go.
So make sure to begin in the beginning, and then keep reading. And then we'll send out a book, request for a book report. All of you single parent daily listeners, we're expecting a full book report on Debbie's book by next week.
Yeah. And remind us what you need to.
Exactly.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Debbie, thank you so very much for being on the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Our
Yeah,
pleasure.
Thank you, Debbie. Appreciate you.
All right. Well, thank you guys for tuning in for another edition of the Single Parents Daily Podcast with your hosts,
Chady Denmore.
and Evan DeMarco. Make sure to check us out on iTunes or whatever other platform you get. This will also be on YouTube. We'll make sure to put all of Debbie's notes in the show notes, all of her notes in the show notes. God, I've lost it today.
Okay,
I'm
it's
done.
Friday.
Her information in the show notes. It's Friday. I'm going to go have my third vodka tonic or second tea or whatever it is that I'm drinking. And we'll come back with you next week.